Okay, history faithful. Today we're going to be looking at Roman history. I wrote this material up. We'll be looking at part one and part two. We'll also begin actually by looking at what's the big deal about Roman history to begin with. Why, as a Western civilization, do we need to look at Rome, and maybe even broader, why does anybody else outside of Western civilization have a debt to what the Romans had built and the legacy of their empire? Second part two is from the city to empire. Then we'll be looking at how Rome became an empire, its decline, and finally collapse and legacy. But we'll be looking at part one and two today. Let's move. Here we go. You see in the top left is a picture of appears children suckling off of a wolf. It's a story of Romulus and Remus. Like many people of the ancient world, they were curious about their past, and the story of a wolf that had basically adopted two abandoned children, raising them and suckling them, Romulus and Remus. The story is the beginning of Rome's history. Romulus, of course, his name is in the city of Rome, and Remus, of course, was killed, kind of like a Cain and Abel story. Romulus killed Remus, and that fratricide, or killing of his brother, was the beginning of a city and the beginning of its history. On the bottom right, you have a picture of a model of what Rome looks like today. And take a look at that. You'll notice many of the features that we will see in a modern city: public spaces, and stadiums, things of that nature, public water. All these things are miracles of Roman engineering. Why do we even need to care? Rome engineered many of the features that we would see and expect in a modern city. The Latin word civis, which is where we get the word civilization from, is a Latin word for city. The Romans engineered cities and roads to connect them through trade, civil engineering. The Romans were remarkable civil engineers. The idea of societies emanating from cities and cities that support large, stable populations, the Romans did that like no one else could in the ancient world. Public water and sanitation systems. The Romans invented concrete and cement, and their empire was a physical empire, an empire of structure. Stadiums and theaters and other features of the cities that we come to know, and even the idea of how we govern cities. The Latin word legis means law, where we get the word legislate from. So, in much of our law and our legal dialogue is drawn by Latin. So, if you go to law school, you'll be learning a lot of Latin phrases because our legal system draws very heavily from the ones that developed by the Romans all over 2,000 years ago. Roman patterns of law, citizenship, and government are the basis of our modern society. Although the Romans adapted and made practical many of the ideas of their brethren, the Greeks, who came in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea a little earlier than they did, these civilizations became the foundation of our modern day world. The Roman alphabet, you're looking at it right now. Although lowercase letters were added by the 9th or 8th or 9th century, that the letters you have, for the most part, were letters, Roman adaptations of Greek and Phoenician letters, and as an alphabet, it's the most common writing system around the world. The language of Latin itself, not just in law, but in biology, and probably 40 to 60% of our vocabulary has a clear Latin root to it. Usually, oftentimes, the more advanced vocabulary is very heavily Latin, so that having taken Latin in high school, it really has helped my vocabulary. I can figure what a word means by looking at it. For example, I use the word fratricide. The word frater means brother in Latin, and cidere means to kill, like suicide. Sui, by the way, in Latin means yourself. So you get an idea about how Latin is influencing the way we think and how we construct our ideas and words. Rome's pattern of dynamic expansion and subsequent decline, a rise and fall of empires, seems to be something that kind of permeates how we think about history. It's like our mandate of heaven, that somehow along the line that empires and states would rise and they fall. That idea has been, we often use Rome as a model for that. Now, one of the issues is, why would Rome be this one civilization, this one culture? Why would they have such a durable foundation in Western, in world history? First off, it thrived for a long time, nearly 1,000 years in the cultural core in Italy, almost 500 years in a broader area, like in the areas of France and Spain. The Roman Empire took England, if I find my pointer, right up here, by about the 1st century CE, and and eventually even took in parts of Turkey. So these areas, even that might be considered outside of the generally accepted idea of Western world, like Turkey, Turkey has a large degree of Roman influence within it. It merged with Hellenistic Greek culture. For 1,500 years, there's an empire that has its Roman traditions in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, right here. The Roman civilization impacted large areas of the world. That starting at around 1300, we may just briefly talk about later, is that people in Italy and later on greater in Europe began to try to re-engage their Roman past. And this was the time of the Renaissance. You may have heard of like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci. They were attempting to try to, there were writers too like Shakespeare who drew very heavily on classical Greek and Roman ideas. And during the end of this period, during the end of the Renaissance, by the 1500s, countries of Western Europe, particularly the Dutch, the English, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, are going to spread their cultures through exploration and trade. And you're going to see, for example, a Latinized language, Spanish, spoken in places the Romans never knew existed, that is in Latin America. So, of course, even in distant Australia where English is used, the Roman alphabet and Roman culture and impacts are spread that much further. So on that map below, you'll see the blues and purples represent areas where we see Western civilization, Greco-Roman. So Rome wasn't built in a day. Here's a brief idea of its chronology. We believe that the first people known as the Latins settled in central Italy along the Tiber River, which is where Rome is, about as early as 1000 BC, about the time when Greece was emerging from this dark age. We know that in 509 BC, the Romans set up something called a Respublica, a republic. We'll talk about that later on. And that kind of follows at the time of the Hellenic and early Hellenistic period. The later empires, when Rome and Greece kind of collide, Rome captures and conquers Greece, but is also influenced by their brother classical culture. And that takes us almost to the time of the Common Era, the time of the birth of Jesus. Jesus is born in the Roman Empire, and our calendar is based on the birth of Jesus. So you can see that the Pax Romana, or the Peace of Rome, would straddle the life of Jesus, who was born, actually it was 4 BC because of an error in calculation, but essentially we would say the beginning of the Common Era. Rome's decline between 180 and 500 CE, that would be Rome's decline in the West, although an empire, a Roman Empire in the East would exist almost at the time of Columbus. From the city to a republic. The expansion of the republic gave Rome's spice a wider geographic reach that would have greater staying power in Europe. Its influence would be spread globally for about 1,000 years after the fall of Europe's global expansion. Like Athens, Rome became a city-state, but it would expand. And you can take a look at the map here. You see the city of Rome right here. Rome controlling much of Italy, or Italia as they refer to that, eventually moving into Gaul, which is modern-day France, and then Spain. And we'll see them taking on Greece too, but the empire will continue to expand. So Rome, like Athens, began as a city-state, but would go much further than that. Like the Greeks, the Romans attempted to use myths to try to connect to their ancient past. I've already talked about the story of Romulus and Remus. One interesting piece is the Romans dated their city from when they believed when Romulus founded the city, 753 BC. But we date from the birth of Jesus, the Roman calendar dates from Anno Urbis Dedicorum, from the year of the dedication of the city. So the year 1 in the Roman calendar was 753 BC. Even the way we set up a calendar with a common year, although we don't base it on Romulus but on Jesus, that calendar is that the Romans developed this idea of a calendar. We know around 1000 BC, Rome had basically settled that area. They were surrounded by more sophisticated neighbors like the Etruscans, which we read about. When they kicked out the Etruscans in 509 BC, they set up a republic. And one of the traditions of Rome that became a tradition in America was this hatred of kings. The Roman phrase "Sic semper tyrannis," which means "thus always the tyrants." It's an interesting history. It means that we will kick out tyrants. Ironically, or interestingly enough, that was the words of John Wilkes Booth when he killed President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. "Sic semper tyrannis." It's also the state motto for Virginia. The Latin idea of res publica, a rule in the name of the public, is something else we see a clear connection by this. And what made Rome strong was a well-organized army made by citizen soldiers, which is another ideal that America tries to extend. Here you have a picture of the Roman hero Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was a story that all Romans knew. The farmer who rose up to lead an army to defend the enemy, and when he was seen as a hero and would have been made king, he handed back his symbol of authority. And here it's the facies, or the bundles of sticks with the axe on it. And he turned it back in and went back to plowing his field. He refused to become a tyrant. Well, on the bottom picture, you have a classical version of, yes, George Washington. And this piece of art looked at George Washington as a modern-day Cincinnatus, a man who, when leading the American military in the Revolutionary War, went back and handed his piece of authority, which is his facies, or his bundle of sticks. There you can see in the bottom, holding it and offering it back to the people. That power was not his. That, of course, is another place how Roman civilization influenced the early American Republic, or Respublica, thousands of years later. Rome had suffered periodic attacks from its neighbors, but was able to create alliances like the Delian League. But Rome would treat conquered territories as self-governing, would eventually extend citizenship. The Romans tried to sell a way of life. So instead of treating people as conquered slaves, they attempted to called them soci, or allies. The soci means the term friend, amicus. So by 250 BC, the city of Rome was ruling most of Italy. Rome did not grow an empire by killing and replacing people. They simply made people who already lived there as Rome. They sold a way of life. The way of life was not too culturally intrusive. The Romans generally didn't interfere with religion. They didn't interfere with language. They tried to show, though, by being better connected to Rome, you could elevate your way of life. So this expansion of the Roman way of life through Italy and eventually through all of the European and the Mediterranean basin is going to be the way that Rome would engineer many, many Romes throughout the Mediterranean region, which we'll talk about in a moment. The language of Latin and Roman engineering and Roman law brought many advantages to people, and people over generations would come to see that, whether they were living in England, Spain, or present-day Jordan or Egypt. Rome also was changed by the fact that it was a very diverse and cosmopolitan empire. So the ideas that Rome would try to transplant other places, well, other ideas kind of came into Rome too, including, as we'll see, Christianity. Hundreds of cities of Afro-Eurasia have their history in Roman regions, like, for example, the city of Paris, London. These were all Roman cities at the first time. Vienna. And in these cities, Rome would create the impact of its spice. It created like nerve centers by which Rome would not just militarily control, but they would also places where Rome would set up sort of like they were cultural centers. And from those places, those cities, Rome's culture would permeate throughout. Rome's protection of order and movement of people permitted the mixing of ideas, including Christianity. The Latin word civis is where we get the word civilization from, is a Roman word for city. The Republic worked by having a couple of classes. There were patricians and plebeians. The patricians were nobles, and the plebeians were lower class people, but they achieved some rights also through the use of tribunes. You can see a map there on the right. The Romans did not like dictators very much, and dictators could only have temporary power in times of emergency for 6-month terms. When Julius Caesar became dictator for life, it was a revolutionary issue. This is 40-some years before the Common Era. Rome kept a separation of powers between executive, judiciary, and legislative, which is, of course, reborn in countries like the United States. A balanced oligarchy, that is the right of noble senators, and aristocracy and democracy. It was a mixed government. There was checks and balances in order to try to avoid tyranny, and it worked for a long time. And that's about what we have to see about this. So when we're done here, I want you to take a quiz. The quiz will be on Google Form, and then go to your reading and continue your reading on Roman history. Okay, folks, thank you.